Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. I really enjoy that. It's probably not good for me to get quite so relaxed before the program, but if that was not an intro, it certainly would be worthwhile as just a relaxing moment to catch our breaths. And if you're watching this, you get a little bit of relaxing music and the absolutely beautiful picture of the stream. Every so often, I will get a question on the site that I don't know if it's meant to detract from the position or not, but it presents an interesting question to answer. And that happened recently in an exchange. We had the thing about the resurrection and a discussion about it, and some interchange occurred between me and a gentleman named Damian Jackson. And he asked a question that I went, this is a very interesting question. Why is he asking it? And what does this question mean? And how do we deal with it? And so that's what we're going to end up doing tonight. Now I'm going to go to our screen share so that you can be introduced to the question, and then we can deal with the answer. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this and go to screen 2. There we go. Now, Damien wanted to know why Jesus would sacrifice 7 bullocks, 7 rams, and I believe his question stated 6 lambs, but it could have been 7 lambs. And I thought that was a terribly interesting question. And why is he asking it? And what does he mean by it? And so we're going to look at that, and we're going to go in depth a little bit as far as the kingdom. So this affords us some really neat opportunities to look at some things and see where things are going to go. So I welcome questions. I really do, for further exploration. They'll either be a later broadcast or they'll end up being in this broadcast. This one really caught my eye. And so that's why I ended up doing this. So let's try to get an understanding of what this question means, because there were several things that could be intended to. By the way, I do want to make a quick shout out. Do you notice the neat overlay? That's courtesy of Mr. Phil Fox. Thank you, brother Phil Fox, for doing that. You can see the share, like, and subscribe with the logos where we're at. Warning, Facebook is starting to play games with me, and I hope they'll stop that. But I have a few apologist friends that say Facebook's starting to do some strange things. So let's look at what could be meant by this question. Damien could be asking why Jesus would sacrifice a particular offering with the exact number of goats, rams, and bullocks mentioned in Ezekiel 43, which makes sense when you look at the daily dedication offering over the period of 7 days. In other words, it doesn't state that many animals. It states one of each for a period of 7 days, at least as far as the rams and bullocks are concerned. And so if you add it up, you would get your 7. And that could be what he's asking. Why is Damien going to go ahead and give this particular offering? I mean, this particular offering somehow seems out of character or seems strange. But there is another possibility as to what Damien could be asking. And sometimes when people put questions or comments up, even though I get very interesting comments, I don't necessarily get a lot of clarification as to exactly what's being asked. So I don't have the background of what the person's thinking. And it's not like I can engage with them directly. So I have to kind of ferret out what the real question is. The other possibility is that Damien is asking why Jesus would sacrifice any animals at all, given his death on the cross. So maybe it's more of a general question about sacrifices in general in the millennial kingdom and Jesus. So that is a possibility. And so we're going to kind of look at both of these, and whichever one Damien's asking, hopefully will get answered. All right. Now, both of these relate to Ezekiel. We're going to see that there are 2 chapters that may be conflated, but the main chapter that has this particular offering in it, that Damien seems to be referring to, if I understand correctly, is Ezekiel 43. And so that's kind of the way I'm going to end up looking at that. But since they're both about Ezekiel, it doesn't hurt for us to look at both of these. And I'm just getting some highs out there. And wow, Facebook is actually letting me broadcast this tonight, so that's cool. And a shout out to my sister down under there. This isn't going to type the way I want it to because it just won't. I'm just not that good a typist. It's just the way it is. I use the Yoda method of typing. So let's look at Ezekiel. Let's just get a background of Ezekiel. This is where you should really start whenever you're dealing with a question is you always go back. And if this seems repetitive, it's because, I'm laying down a methodology here that could be used with any apologetics question. And so, in Hebrew, repetition is just emphasis. It's not a big deal. You do need to know a few things about Ezekiel. The oracles in his book span a 22-year period, which is really pretty incredible. You don't always get that big a span. We also need to know that Ezekiel was a priest. There's going to be a lot of information here about sacrifices in the temple, and understand that his priestly background shows itself in his concern for ceremonial cleanness and his emphasis on the temple. So it's logical that Ezekiel would be the guy to go ahead and have addressed some of these things. He was married, but his wife dies during the course of his ministry. In fact, one of the things God says is you can't take time to fully mourn her. Unlike Jeremiah, though, Ezekiel spends his prophetic career in Babylon. Now, remember, Jeremiah is carried away to Egypt. And so there's a little difference there. Now, this background is not just Jeff Cran, but L. John McGregor in his commentary. The New Bible Commentary is a very good commentary. And different men wrote different sections based on different books. And so that's why you're going to see that. And we should be able to go here. It's apocalyptic literature. Now, that's going to be very important. Now, apocalyptic literature is a specific type of literature. We see it in Revelation. We see it in certain Old Testament prophets. And it uses a lot of symbolism. So it's not as straightforward, and it's highly it's just, how do I explain this? It's almost like the difference between like a sci-fi thing and like a regular Jane Austen sort of. I mean, that's like a weird way to put it. I'm trying to find ways to but it's highly symbolic. And so it's a little different than maybe reading different literature. And so the temptation with books like Revelation or apocalyptic literature is to treat them all as symbolic and totally treat everything in the book as allegorical. And I kind of want to warn against that. Apocalyptic literature doesn't mean that we have to treat everything in an allegorical manner. What it does mean is that we need to look at the text and related scripture in order to get what the prophets say. This is especially true of the book of Revelation. All the symbolism in Revelation is explained. People speculate wildly about the book of Revelation. The interpretive key to Revelation is found in Revelation and certain other key books. In other words, Revelation expands out what's in Daniel and certain other key books. And I really wish, or, if I had my druthers, my dream, I would say that pastors who are going to go through Hebrews need to take people through Leviticus first. If you're going to go through Revelation, you have to take people through Daniel. And I kind of wish it was done more that way, because it would make the symbolism mean so much more sense. And so let's not allegorize everything. Okay. Now, what is the message of Ezekiel? Because that's going to be like his purpose statement. By the way, one of the key things is the phrase, then they will know that I am the Lord, appears over and over again in the book. But L. John McGregor wants us to know that as a book, it consists of initial warnings of calamity, followed by promises of restoration. Now, this is true of the prophets in general. Okay. And so ultimately they'll be saved from their misery. But yes, it's good to have Slam RN, aka Susan, with some Hebrew. She's wishing everybody shalom, wholeness, peace, which is absolutely great. And so that's what you kind of need to understand with the background. And I'm laying the background because Damien is asking a question, but it really hinges on one chapter of Ezekiel and touches on another chapter of Ezekiel. Okay. And so you're going to see that. Now, the main disaster in mind is the Babylonian captivity, which is like a really big thing for the Jewish people. If I could list a series of crises for the Jewish people, the Babylonian captivity would be one of them. And a lot of the material you're seeing in the prophets relates to the scenario of the Babylonian captivity and the letting the people of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, know that they were not going to escape the wrongdoing they did. Here's what it's not about. It's not about the Atlantic slave trade. See, if you put the prophets back in their context, pay attention to what they're saying, and when they're saying it, you don't have it being about like a James Bond movie in 2000. So, and that's kind of helpful. We're going to deal with the main passage because the main passage that deals with these lambs and these bullocks and these goats is Ezekiel 43. And so we've looked at the main overarching themes and background of Ezekiel. But the passage that talks about the bullocks and goats is Ezekiel 43. And so we need to delve in here a little bit. Okay, now this is a little blocked. So I'm going to take off my overlay for just a second. We're going to examine these questions by looking at the passage there. Okay. Now, let me break the passage into two parts because it breaks into two parts, or two pericope, as I like to call them. These are the measurements of the altar in cubits. In case you need to know, I'm going to turn off the screen share so you can see what a cubit is. Okay, a cubit is the distance from the tip of the finger to the elbow. And in most human beings, it's approximately 18 inches. Now, I have a short arm, so I'm a little bit under the 18 mark. It's just the way I'm built. I'm kind of stocky, but it's roughly about 18 inches. So it's the measurement of the altar in cubits. And here it just notes that a cubit is a little bit more than a cubit. The base is 1 cubit high and 1 cubit wide. By the way, that would indicate a square with a rim all around the edge, 1 span. Okay, now you're going, what is a span? Well, a span, unlike a cubit, is about the distance from here to here. Now, I don't even know what that is on a normal human being. And again, I'm not the measure of the tallest guy in the world, but that's a span, just so you know. So we're dealing with a lip around it that's 1 span. The height from its base to the ground and the lower ledge is 2 cubits, with a width of the ledge of 1 cubit, and a smaller ledge to the larger ledge 4 cubits, and the width of the ledge 1 cubit. The altar heath is 4 cubits high. The 4 horns extend outward from the heath. So you have these 4 horns on the altar. By the way, tradition has it that the sacrifice had to be tied to all 4 of the horns in order to be sacrificed. And so you have 14 cubits and 14 cubits on the 4 sides with a rim. 1 cubit around the base and 1 cubit all the way around, and its steps face towards the east. So the altar is facing towards the east. Now, that's our first pericope. Okay. Now, there are 2 pericopes to this passage. Okay. Now, that first pericope is all about the measure of the altar and the temple, and it focuses on the altar. Okay. Now, the first thing I want to say is, why does one have to know how many cubits something that is purely symbolic is? If you're not going to make it, why do you need the measurements? The only possibility is that the number of cubits is directly symbolic in some way. And if that were the case, there would have to be other writings or other information that would let us know what those symbols mean, because the Bible interprets itself. All right. So here's the way I look at this. I don't look at these as being purely symbolic. Okay. Because it's a lot of information. Ken Ham says, well, given Ken Ham's arm size, that may be true. Ken Ham says that it's 18. Ken Ham is not Jeff Cran, so we'll allow for my general shortness of stature and stockier build than Ken Ham, who looks slightly more. I've met him in person. He's more kind of thin boned. And so, give or take a Jeff Cran hand. Okay. Because I know where my hand kind of goes. But I'm weird. So the measurements are there. Look, these detailed measurements indicate this isn't symbolic. They indicate it to me. And Ken Ham makes the same comment about the ark. Essentially, we have a real live object with real live dimensions that need to be made a certain way and are not symbolic. And so if you were trying to be symbolic, you would then try to indicate that 4 cubits means something in particular in symbolism. Now, a lot of times what people do to deal with this is they say, well, it's not possible that this temple and this altar would exist. Therefore, these things have to be symbolic. That's circular reasoning. You've assumed they can't exist. And then you say these things have to be interpreted this way, which proves that they don't exist because they can't exist. Okay. In other words, you started with a premise, and then you go ahead and interpret the things through the premise in order to prove the premise that you're interpreting things through. And that's really circular reasoning. And I find that to be inappropriate and bad Bible study method in general. That's just not the way you want to handle things. And so I have no problem, as you're going to see, with these things in Ezekiel really pointing to something very real. Okay. Now, the core of the passage is really verses 17 through 27, as I understand what Damien's asking here. So let's look at the core of the passage that really seems to be where I think he's sort of going and what I think he's connecting to something else. And he said to me, Son of man, thus saith the Lord God, these are the ordinances for the altar on the day when it was made, for sacrificing the burnt offerings on it and for the sprinkling of blood on it. And you shall give a young bullock for a sin offering to the priests and the Levites, who are of the seed of Zadok, who approach me to minister to me, says the Lord. And you shall take some of the blood and put it on the 4 horns. That's the 4 horns of the altar, and the 4 corners of the ledge, and on the rim around it. And you shall cleanse it to make atonement for it. Then you should take a bullock of a sin offering and burn it in the appropriate place of the temple outside the sanctuary. On the 2nd day, you shall take after a kid of goats without blemish for a sin offering. You shall cleanse the altar, and shall be cleansed with the bull. When you have finished cleansing it, you shall offer a young bull without blemish and a ram from the flock without blemish. And when you offer them before the Lord, the priest shall throw salt on them, and you shall offer them up as a burnt offering every day for 7 days. Now, see, this is where I think he's getting the 7 bullocks and the 7 rams. Okay, is what I think he's doing is he's looking at this passage here, and this process for the altar needs to go on every day. So if you take one ram and one bullock and one goat and you do the addition, which is what I think he's doing, this is where he's getting, why would Jesus sacrifice 7 bullocks, 7 rams? And he may have said 7 goats, and I wrote 6. You shall make it for the altar and purify it to consecrate it. See, when the days are over, it shall be on the 8th day hereafter that the priest shall offer your burnt offering and your peace offerings on the altar, and I will accept you, says the Lord. So the offerings are acceptable after the altar has been dedicated for the 7 days. And that's the core passage. And I think that's where Damien's going to. And he's connecting this to why Jesus would do that. And Elizabeth says that it's cool. I met him. Yes, but he probably won't remember me. I was introduced by Dr. John C. Whitcomb. And then there's a question about whether a horn would be a tittle. I don't connect the two directly because a tittle has to do with the lettering. And a tittle is very small. It's like the crown of a letter. But as we saw from the measurements of these horns, they were a little bit more substantial. So my first gut reaction is that when I picture the horns the way they're described, and I picture a tittle, and I know that a tittle refers to the lettering, but the horns seem to be like a solid piece with the altar, then I tend not to think so. So I'm not making a dogmatic statement. I'm making a statement based on usage, and then I'm making a statement based on size, because that'd be a fairly large tittle on a letter. Okay. Now we have to get into the purpose. Now if it's the second question for Damien, why Jesus would offer sacrifices. And she says she was told. I'll have to check into that. Maybe the word has a root. I just don't picture a tittle and a horn at the same time, but it could be that a tittle is a crown that looks like a horn, and so you have language of appearance or some related root. So I'm not going to be dogmatic. I'm just going to say I hadn't heard that before. But I love the questions, and I do want to say a hi to Chris. It's always good to see you. Kind of came into the room here, and I didn't see him. Now, the purpose of these passages are the regulations for the offerings and the priests, and I'm just laying that down because he's gone right to this section here. And he's asking why Jesus would sacrifice this offering, particularly if it's the second question, as I understand as being is. Okay. And so, if he means the second thing, particularly, again, I can't totally tell. He could be saying why this particular offering or why offerings in general, but if he means this particular offering, this is kind of where he's going, and the regulations were for the priests. And so that's all I'm bringing up here is, I'm guessing a little. Now, I think where he's getting this is, remember the beginning where the Lord said, Son of Man. Okay, now I'm going to bring that up real quick and bring up Ezekiel 43. Okay. And I'm going to go to Ezekiel 43, and you're going to see, I think this is where he gets this from. Okay. Okay. There we go. And I'm going to move down to 17. See how I did that? And okay. And okay, there we go. And it's really 18. All right. And it might be a little hard to see. So I'm going to close one window off here because we don't need the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to increase the size of this just a little bit. You can do this You can do this under program scaling in Logos Bible. There we go. And that should make it bigger in just a second. And what you're going to see in 18, and I think this is what he's picking up on here, is he sees the term Son of Man. Okay? And seeing the term Son of Man in 18, he said to me, Son of Man, thus saith the Lord, these are the ordinances for the altar on the day when it is made. He's seeing the Son of Man. And I think that might be what's on his mind as he's asking his question related to this section. Okay, I think that he's seeing Son of Man, and I think he's drawing some inferences from it. And that's where he's probably getting this from. And I think what's happening is he's misunderstanding the term Son of Man. Because what you need to understand about this passage is the term Son of Man here is Ezekiel. Now, I know Jesus used the term Son of Man a lot, but Ezekiel uses it for himself. So there's a usage in Daniel that Jesus is pointing back to, and there's a different usage of the same phrase in Ezekiel that points to Ezekiel. This is where context is very important. And I think what he's done is he's conflated the two. See, this sort of thing happens quite a bit and a lot. And by the way, this is the sort of thing that cults will do. They'll take a term in two different places being used different ways, and they won't pay attention to how they're using. And then they'll draw this whole big point, which is not necessarily relevant, okay? Ezekiel is discussing himself receiving the revelation of God. Thus saith the Lord, Son of Man. These are the ordinances. And the Son of Man there is Ezekiel. And so this is where he's doing some bad Bible interpretation and not paying attention that the same phrase is being used by Jesus and Daniel in the same light, but is being used by Ezekiel differently. Okay, and this is just sloppy Bible interpretation. The command is given to Ezekiel. The consecration is adjoined upon him and as the representative for the nation, but as a prophet upon whom it is frequently the case, the prophetic narratives, those things are said to be enjoined, which is to be set in operation through the proclamation. Now, what am I saying here? I'm saying Jeff Cran is not the only person who noticed that in the context it's Ezekiel. And by the way, these are not slouches. This is, again, Kyle and Delich. Now, you know, the thing is, when you have scholarship, you have scholarship. I will see people from certain cults and stuff poo-poo scholarship and say that you're doing commentary. You're not doing commentary, you're doing research. Okay, there are sound men who have been soundly trained, and they may not always be right, but they should not be poo-pooed. And the likes of Kyle and Delich definitely shouldn't be. And so this is their commentary on the Old Testament. They're just very noted, and they've been around. This is like a classic. So this is not new information, okay? Now, who's really doing the sacrifices? Because if I'm understanding Damon's question is, why would Jesus sacrifice 7 bullocks and 7 rams and 6 or 7 goats? So he seems to think that Jesus will actually be doing the sacrificing. But is that really the case according to the passage? And so he's told, you shall give a young bull for a sacrifice to the priests, the Levites, who are of the seed of Zadok. Now, this is extra stuff here. Zadok was not the only line of priests, but remember that hey, D News here. Remember that there was a certain priest in Judges. Remember Eli? And Eli's sons were an absolute disaster and a half. Okay? And so Eli was cursed. None of your sons, basically, I'm going to cut you off from the priesthood, and your sons will be begging bread. Now, that doesn't fully happen until David's time. But the branch of the Levites that is allowed to take over are the seed of Zadok. who is faithful. And so these young bullocks for sacrifice are given to the priest, as are the other offerings, and particularly the priests of the sons of Zadok. Now look at the reference. It's Ezekiel 43:19, right after this section starts, and you have the Hebrew, okay? Vinatata el hakohanim halivim asher chem mitzarah Zadok in Hebrew. And what I want you to see is the word that's in black there on your screen, El, and it has a line. It's in a construct case, meaning those two words go together as a single thought. And then you have the idea that it will be given to the priests, the Levites, who are them from the seed of, or who are of the seed of Zadok. And that little to or towards there that's in black indicates that that's who the offerings are being given to. Now, why I want you to know this is I think he's conflating chapter 43, and I believe it's 37 of Ezekiel. We'll go into it further, and he's conflating the prince in the previous chapter way up there in the 30s, and I believe it's 37, with this passage in 43 with the term Son of Man, to ask why Jesus would be offering what he believes that he is offering. Okay, and so I think that's what he's kind of doing here. But what I want you to point out is that the Hebrew says that the offerings are clearly given to the priest. So it's not the prince or Ezekiel that is doing the offering here. So when we're looking at his question, he seems to have the wrong people doing the offerings to begin with. Now, the other thing is, I think he's thinking about the cross and saying, well, why would there be sacrifices at all? We have Jesus's death to take care of sin. And so it makes no sense for Jesus to be offering anything. Well, we've established that the passage doesn't seem to indicate Jesus is offering. But what are the offerings for? Now, I want you to pay close attention to this, because this is really important. The offering, the bullock, the goat, and the ram each day, and the number of offerings adds up to 7, is important for when we understand the purpose of these offerings. Okay, now as I'm looking at the Hebrew, Yikiparu et hamitzbeach v'techaru. Okay, now what that means in Hebrew, very clearly, and I'm just looking at the larger writing so I can see the vowel pointings. It's a vision thing. Is that it's to make atonement for the altar, to make it pure. It is not atonement for sin. So the purpose of these offerings was not to make atonement for sin, but rather purify the offering. That last word is and cleanse, from the word to clean, and it's to make clean the altar and to provide atonement for the altar. So it does not have to do with sin. Now, why would the altar need to be cleansed in a future temple? Now, understand this. This is like really good theology here. Understand something. When we are changed, we will have what's called a glorified body. I like this. This is like a body without the sin program included. Okay, so we will be changed. It doesn't mean it's a purely spiritual body. Okay, Jesus ate fish, but he also walked through walls. Okay, so it wasn't a Casper the Friendly Ghost situation, because Casper doesn't do well with fish dinners, but it wasn't a normal body, because I don't do real well walking through walls. If I walk into a wall, it hurts. And so this is a special type of glorified body. But the key thing about a glorified body is that our sin nature will be removed. Okay, so we're going through, we have basic justification. Okay, that takes care of the debt of sin. We have sanctification that takes care of the presence of sin. We should say we have justification takes care of the penalty of sin. We have sanctification, which takes care of the presence of sin. We have glorification, which sanctification, which takes care of the power of sin, and then glorification, which takes care of the presence of sin. So we will have glorified bodies. Okay? But see, here's the problem. Israel gets saved, but they don't have their glorified bodies. So they're still walking around with sin natures. Now, Jesus is God full in his full glory. The temple is, totally holy ground here. And you got sinful men approaching it. That's why the priests had to do offerings for themselves and offerings to purify the temple instruments. Because, see, these hands are tainted by sin. And so when I go ahead, I touch something, I am not totally sinless. And so that object is not totally pure in the presence of God. And so that's where the Israelites are. Okay. The priests will still have bodies that contain a sin nature. This was the pattern throughout the Tanakh. You see these offerings in order to purify the tabernacle and dedicate it, and the altar and the instruments, and all of this stuff was sprinkled with blood. It had to be. But it's not about forgiveness of sin. And this is where the big hang up is. If it was, then you'd have a real problem. But you don't have a problem because we're talking about the purification of the altar here. So let's talk about what's going on here. And now I get to introduce Sean. Okay, now the first thing I want to do is give you some wonderful additional links here and give some credit where credit is due. Dr. John C. Whitcomb was an incredible teacher of the scriptures. I had the opportunity to sit under him pre-seminary with some seminary-like or seminary level material. He's still got a ministry. He's gone on to glory, but his kids have captured all of his material and have made it available. Now, I don't often do this. Maybe that's not like smart as a missionary, but I did put up the support page for Whitcomb Ministries. And I also put up where this free resource is. So I feel I can do this. I know Dr. Whitcomb, and I know his passion for giving out the word of God. And he would not mind believers having this material. And it is free. So it's not a charge thing on the website. I'm giving you the link for free because that would be taking away from his ministry. But I am here to amplify his ministry. And so those links are there. I do not know. I can't really copy them here. Oops. But I will go ahead and do that later on in the chat real quick. Maybe while the thing's going, I can put those in the thing. I welcome you to go to his site at wickhamministries.org and just see the free stuff that's up there. He did a lot of good material with George Zemek, whose links I put up before. Okay. Oh, by the way, I let his ministry know I was doing this. I was going to give full accreditation. He wrote an article in the Grace Theological Journal, which this website is a copy of that article placed on the web. Okay. Now, I want you to read what he says. In contrast to Hebrews, then, it is not between the church and Israel under the new covenant or between the spiritual sacrifices offered by the church, and that's Hebrews 13:15, the praise of our lips and good deeds, and the animal sacrifices which Israel will someday offer under the new covenant. It is rather between the shadowy, insufficient nature of the old covenant and the sufficient, permanent nature of the new covenant. Now, I'm not bad-mouthing the old covenant or the Tanakh, okay? But there was something greater promised, which was Messiah. This is so key, okay? The foundations are laid in the old, but the foundations point to something greater. I loved it when Ravi Zacharias said that to Ben Shapiro. We believe what you believe, but believe the things given to your people and given in the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, point to something greater. See, that is the way to handle that. And so that's a quote, and that's page, well, you can look between 201 and 217 for that. He further goes on to say, in the covenant at Sinai, God provided a highly complex and rigid structure for his kingdom of priests. He's getting that from Exodus, where Israel is called to be a kingdom of priests. Within that structure, notice the bold, the national /theocratic transgression would receive national theocratic forgiveness. Do you understand that? It's not about individual forgiveness. It's about God's forgiveness of the theocratic nation as a whole, when appropriate sacrifices were offered to God through legitimate priests of the tabernacle, temple, altar, the forgiveness that was promised regardless of the spiritual state of the offender. Now, what that means is Israel could be forgiven according to the sacrificial system if I was not a nice Jewish person and offered sacrifices. That's noted in terms of Exodus 12:13, cross-reference Exodus 12:23. Do you realize that on the night of the Passover, if I was a not nice, not regenerate, okay, not necessarily totally faithful Israelite, and I put blood on the doorpost, the angel of death still passed over me? Okay, because the covenant agreement or promise of God to the nation was still in effect. And if I took part in that promise, I still was protected. And that's the way this sort of worked. Blood never cleansed the conscience from sin. See Hebrews 10:1 and 2. Now, do understand this. This is so cool. You guys are going to be ahead of so many people if you understand the difference between the theocratic nature of things and individual forgiveness of sin. So I could partake in Israel's theocratic blessings and not necessarily be a saved person. Now, see, it doesn't work like that now. If you don't know Jesus Christ, you don't get in on the new covenant blessings. But under the old covenant, I could be a Jewish person and enjoy certain temporal and material blessings that Israel got as long as I was in fellowship with the nation. That's why I talk about things called variegated nomism, because that's closer to the way things worked. Now, it didn't mean I enjoyed eternal salvation. Okay? I could enjoy a lifetime of benefits under the theocratic nation of Israel. She was being obedient to God and still end up being eternally separated from God because it was a different issue, which is what Dr. Whitcomb's going to point out by quoting, and I included both references here, Richard F. Averbeck in his unpublished Master of Divinity thesis done at Winona Lake when he went to Grace Theological Seminary. Okay, and so he's being quoted by Dr. Whitcomb, which, by the way, was a professor at Grace Theological Seminary. So I'm sure they did coffee together. All right. And he analyzed the word kephar, which is frequently used in Leviticus, but it's used in terms of to cover rather than to appease or cleanse. And he's pointing out that Christ's sacrifice was of the kind that could form a basis for eternal and spiritual salvation. But that doesn't create any problem with the efficacy of Old Testament atonement sacrifices. But why would this be so, Jeff, you ask? And that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Because the article goes on to say that those sacrifices had to do with covenant relationship between God and Israel. Eternal spiritual salvation was not the issue. Now, understand why this affects witnessing to Jewish people, because they don't think of salvation in highly individual terms. Why? Because the sacrificial system was theocratic and they were used to think of it in more corporate terms, because that's the way things seem to function. So, I mean, does that help you with witnessing to Jewish people a little bit? Therefore, animal sacrifices in the Old Testament and the sacrifices of Christ in the New Testament were effective in their respective ways, but those ways were different. And that's the point. So when we're cleansing the altar, we're cleansing the altar. When we're offering sacrifices for the covenant relationship between the nation and God, we're doing that. But in Jesus's case, we're talking about the individual and their maker and the sin problem, which is a different thing. Okay? Is there still a value in the millennial kingdom to have these? Now, understand, you've got the benefit of the entire New Testament and you have communion. But, you know, as John C. Whitcomb points out, there's still a value to this. Before the heavens and earth pass away, who sits from him who sits on the throne, and he's referring to the difference between Revelation 20 and Revelation 21, okay, because there's a little difference between the two. God will provide a final demonstration of the validity of animal sacrifices as what? As an instructor and disciplinary instrument for Israel. The whole world will see the purpose originally intended for the sacrificial system. Okay? It never will function on the level of Calvary's cross. Okay? Which deals with infinite and eternal guilt. That was dealt with by Jesus, but the system did accomplish under God some very important, now he uses the big term pedagogical and disciplinary purposes. That means teaching. Okay? And so you have to understand that strict limits are placed on the national theocracy of Israel during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and that's a reference to the millennial. All right, now why did I do all this? I did this to say, look, the reinitiation of sacrifices during the millennial kingdom is not a step backwards, okay? Because the sacrificial system was a teaching instrument, and the world will end up seeing the original purpose of the system and what it was supposed to teach and what it demonstrates. And there you go. I don't know how Nate does it. He is like, he's got them up already. Oh, he must have copied them somehow. Okay. Thank you, Nate. There you go. Give Dr. Whitcomb's a look, and you can have the resource. Download the paper. Look at it for yourself, you know. But it's not a step backwards. There are some that will say there can't be sacrifices during the millennial kingdom because that'd be a step backwards. Not really. What it will do is show what the system was originally designed for, as opposed to how it was abused and what it was supposed to teach. Okay. Now let's start getting to an answer to Damien's question, because I know I've laid a lot of groundwork. Okay. First of all, he seems to be conflating Ezekiel 37, which talks about the prince, with Ezekiel 43. Now, if he's indeed doing that, there's no reason to do that. And so I don't really have a reason to believe that Jesus needs to be the person who's doing these sacrifices at all. So, I mean, that's one way out of this, is to understand that it doesn't have to be Jesus that's doing them. Now, he could be thinking that Son of Man refers to Jesus, but what we made clear is that in the passage, Son of Man refers to Ezekiel, so there's no reason at all to use Son of Man as a way of pointing to Jesus doing these sacrifices. The necessary and important purpose of the sacrifices during the millennial kingdom isn't contradicted by the sacrifice of Christ. There's no problem here with having Jesus' sacrifice be a once and for all sacrifice for sin and having sacrifices during the millennial kingdom. There isn't a conflict here. There's no conflict with the epistle to the Hebrews, which is talking about the sacrificial system in terms of Jews going back to it to rely upon it for redemption. That would be a misuse of the sacrificial system. And the writer of Hebrews is also dissuading them from ignoring or neglecting the significance of Jesus and his sacrifice. So, I mean, that's what's going on there. And so that's the point of Hebrews. And there really isn't a problem here. Okay. The millennial kingdom fulfilling the promises that God made to Israel that were irrevocable would indicate that it would include sacrifices. Okay. Because of the non-glorified state of its citizens, the temple precincts need to be kept pure. See, if there was not going to be a literal earthly kingdom with a redeemed Israel out of what's called the time of Jacob's trouble, then you wouldn't need a sacrificial system. But given to the promises to Israel that the new covenant was something they'll eventually enter into, and given the fact that they will not have glorified bodies, there's every reason to believe that a sacrificial system would be indeed necessary and important. And so, Damien, there really isn't a reason to poo-poo the sacrificial system. And there really isn't a reason to think that Ezekiel 43 forces Jesus to be the one doing the sacrifices, because the passage doesn't indicate that. And there really is no reason to find fault with Ezekiel's literal representation of the temple, which really kind of runs from chapter 40 through 45, given the nature of the kingdom and given the nature of Israel. And so it seems like the answer is twofold. Damien, one, Jesus won't be offering the bullocks, and Jesus's sacrifice on the cross doesn't mean bullocks won't be offered. Okay. And so there really isn't an issue here. But it was a great question, and it gave us the chance to understand the sacrificial system and its function in terms of a literal kingdom of God on earth. And it also gave us the chance to look at Ezekiel 43 and distinguish that Ezekiel 37 and 43 do not have to be hyper conflated together. So I'm glad to see people are using that link. And blessings to Dr. Whitcomb's kids who are keeping his material available and alive. I don't know that this raised any big questions except for Damien, who seemed to have had the big questions. And I hope he actually comes back and listens to some of the answers. Who knows? He may have other interesting and fascinating questions for us to look at. Tomorrow, it's weird. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the true meaning of the law and who's your king, which would have gone really, really cool today with the inauguration. But we'll see both how Jesus states the spirit of Torah and then Jesus's own claims about his authority and answer that in terms of who's your king. So that's tomorrow night. I'm going to get ready to put the thing on. We can still have conversation, but I want to say thank you to folks. There was some new material. We saw Wonder Woman. So if you're a patron, you can go ahead and go on Patreon. If you're not, that's okay. I might make that available someday when Facebook actually lets me post a video regularly without every third day barring me from posting a video. I don't know what's going on with that. Okay. I'm just looking over stuff. The link worked great. Some comments related to being gentle or being a Gentile. I hope that if you're a Gentile, you're gentle. That would be cool. I like that. It's great having everybody on. Dinu jumped in the room. Go back later, Dinu, if you want to, and see how this interesting study ended up coming about. I'm going to go to Brand here, and I'm going to thank a few people. Now, if you support us through Chosen People, thank you so much. We need to build up our support team. If you're viewing this and you have never subscribed and you have not considered that, please consider going to that. Nate is always great about the website there, but you can find us real easy. www.chosenpeople.com / and crayons will take you there. The Patreon link is real easy too. But I want to thank those who just want to invest in these videos. And you guys have provided so much equipment and so much help. And, you know, with Phil throwing in that neat, that really, really neat overlay. There we go. Let's show off Mr. Phil Fox's handiwork there. I told him he could be a graphics designer. He's just so awesome. And he's done this for a few of us. I'm going to stop the screen share here. I'm going to thank some folks. Feel thanked if you support us through Chosen People. But I said that I would go ahead and let people see who invested in the videos. And I will go back to comments. We can keep the conversation going. But you'll have some really nice music. Just a real quick, I stuck that up. It's missing an I at the end of the URL. So remember to put that there. And Nate did put it up. So if you look at the conversation, you can go ahead and get it. And I will see you tomorrow. Who's your cake and what is the spirit of Torah is what we'll be dealing with.